you have different classes of trade, which will get different pricing. So home health would get a different pricing for the same med than retail, than acute, and so on. But then you also have within those, you have different price account types. So you have, your GPO price, but then you also have WAC price, which is wholesale acquisition costs, 340B. And then there's all these rules that say, well, if this, then this, if this, then this, if this, then this. And ERPs just can't handle it.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we are going to talk with Curtis McEntire, healthcare executive and founder of Mazree and Trulla. And whole conversation today is about how you out there listening either are already innovators or can be disruptive innovators within your organization. It's where Curtis's story starts. We're going to be talking about it all today, Hayes, and I'm incredibly excited for this discussion.
Oh, it's fun. But listen, there's a lot more than what you just described. We're going to talk about Bobby Axelrod. We're going to talk about Urban Meyer. We're going to talk about football. We're going to talk about a lot of good things. So please stick around. It's going to be awesome.
You forgot pharmacy, which is a big part of it.
That too.
We'll be right back. Stay with us. Curtis McEntire up next.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
Today, Hayes and I have the pleasure of speaking with Curtis McEntire, healthcare executive and founder of Mazree and Trulla, and we're going to be talking about innovating change within the hospital. And I kind of titled this episode, We Are All Disruptors, Curtis. And, anybody who knows your story, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well as we kind of dive in to this conversation. But anybody who knows your story, it's really incredible. And so I'm excited to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun to be with you guys. So I look forward to it.
Well, Curtis is like one of the most fascinating guys in healthcare, right? I mean, he's had his hands in a ton of different areas. But I want to ask you, Curtis, the first question. You went to Utah. You were a swoop, were you not?
I was a Ute. I went to University of Utah, played football there under Urban Meyer. So he was he was our coach when I was there. Played with Alex Smith, who quarterback in the NFL. So yeah. So
what position did he play?
Well, transparently, and this is where I'll lose a lot of credibility here. So I'll just, I was actually recruited as a kicker. So I had a good leg and was recruited as a kicker. But when Urban had come on, he kind of was like, I got my kickers, and the defensive coordinator who knew me well, he said, you're an athlete. I know you could play. And so I ended up switching over to receiver. So I was recruited as a kicker and then was receiver on the scout team. And that's about as far as I made it. I would dress for the games, but there were more talented, faster people ahead of me. So that's my university football story.
Well, I've got some in common. I kicked as well. But the second part of the question would be, what lesson did you learn from Urban Meyer that you might use weekly, monthly?
Great question, Hayes. Great question.
That is such a good question. I tell people this all the time. I learned so much from him. Like, I learned a ton. His ability to, I mean, he was running a business, right? Like, it wasn't like I'm a football coach. Like, he knows marketing and then just running an organization. Like, you look at a football team, there's a lot of personnel, there's a lot of staff, there's everybody involved. And his like accountability. One example was, we were watching film. It was the whole team. We're in a room. We're watching game film on something. And one of the offensive linemen missed his block. And you could see Meyer was just, he's pissed, and he turns on the light. And I thought for sure he was just going to kind of lay into that lineman. And he looked at the offensive line coach and he said, "That's on you." And he just stared at him and in front of everybody, right? But he had this accountability that he made sure that, it wasn't, he was just enforcing and making sure that we as the players knew, all right, if my offensive line coach tells me something, I better do it because he's going to hear it from Urban. So that's just one example. I got plenty of stories for sure.
So do you walk around the halls of your company right now screaming at people?
That's on you. Yeah. I'm not quite that. That's not quite my personality, but I did learn that part of accountability. Like, if you're going to run an organization, whether it's you're leading a team or anything like that, you've got to be able to hold people accountable and say, hey, you have a responsibility. You got to make sure I expect you to take care of that responsibility, because I can't do everything for everybody, right? And so that's why you have good teams, and I think accountability was definitely something that I learned a lot from him.
Well, that's a good story. Thanks for sharing that. We have to offline. We'll have to come up with some more.
I have so many Urban Meyer stories.
I'll tell you, one of my favorite things about that is, if the offensive line coach really has, the lineman, and they really like him as a coach, they're not going to want him to look bad, right? But what a great way for Urban to know if he's a good leader or not. Because if he's not doing a good job with the offensive line, they're all going to sell him down the river. And so that's a great test there too. Curtis, before you were an innovator and after you played football, you worked as a financial analyst in healthcare. And so I just find this, like, you have a lot of different assets and experiences that I think are just really, really interesting. Because sometimes when you think of number cruncher, you don't necessarily think of, oh, that's somebody that's going to innovate and disrupt, but it's actually your whole story of how you've brought innovation within healthcare and then really disrupted the industry to get a handle on things like pharmacy that can be so difficult. So do you want to talk about your work as a financial analyst and how that kind of, grew and really developed your career to where it is today?
Yeah, I mean, I was always a numbers guy. I always, numbers and tech, right? Those are kind of my two big things. And when I graduated college, I somehow kind of ended up in the healthcare realm, had a job offer to go work for Cerner in Kansas City, and then had a job offer to work for Intermountain Healthcare in Salt Lake City, and Salt Lake is my home, and decided to do the Intermountain Healthcare as a finance analyst in their supply chain. And it was just when Intermountain was trying to centralize their supply chain. So they were given 25 resources to hire, and I was one of the 25. It was interesting for me because when I came in, this was 2006, and I came in, and the things that we were doing, they're like, hey, Curtis, this is one of your responsibilities. As people are working on projects and they need data, they're going to need help analyzing that data. So we need you to analyze it for you, or we need you to help them analyze it. And so I was like, okay, well, how does a data request come in? They would fill out a piece of paper on a pencil, like pen and paper, and then they'd go drop it on somebody's desk, and then we would grab the piece of paper. And I'm like, this could be so much better and more automated. And so I ended up kind of using existing tools that we had available, and built, a site where, the data requests could come in and they could get allocated. And then whoever's requesting those, they could see the status of those requests, and we could just attach it right there. Like, let's get rid of the manual processes and paper. But that was just like one example, and it was early on where I realized in healthcare, I'm like, man, there are so many things that are just so manual, and how much paper we're using, and how can we make this more efficient and more automated? And I know that's just kind of a really basic, simple example, but that's kind of what got me going as far as, wanting to innovate more in the space.
And what did you learn about sort of, I think you just said something that was really important, which was taking the tools that you had available, right? Because budgets are slim. Like anybody listening to this is working on a pretty thin budget these days in healthcare. What did you kind of learn about innovating with limited resources? Because I think a lot of times people are like, oh, if we just were able to spend the money, or we don't have the money, so we can't innovate because we can't buy, that technology. Did that kind of teach you something interesting about how to be more flexible and creative in your solutioning?
You do. Like you realize the hospitals the health systems have a lot of tools at their disposal. We just don't know how to use them all. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think people, maybe it's a talent thing. Maybe it's an education thing. Maybe it's, one reason or another. But I was sitting there, the tools I ended up using are just Microsoft tools that our health system already pays for. It's like, why can't I just leverage this? And so you reach out, and I always, as a self-learner, right? And so you see, all right, there's this Microsoft tool. How can I use this Microsoft tool to be able to meet my needs? And we don't have to pay for anything extra. And I think that's the case a lot of times in healthcare. And I've seen it over and over, not just me, where I've seen innovators at health systems that they learn a tool really, really well. And then they're able to kind of use that skill and they do it in one area. And then somebody sees it and they're like, oh, can you do this in my department too? And my department too. And you see it kind of grow. And I think that's where you do see a lot of good innovators. Like the good innovators in healthcare are the ones that they learn how to use the tools that are available to them.
I don't think that they would self-identify always as an innovator either. I don't think that they would, when you think of innovation, you're thinking about new tech, you're thinking about building a business in a lot of cases. And I want to just encourage people who are listening, like if you're doing something similar to what Curtis is describing, like you need to consider yourself an innovator and realize the potential positive impact that you're really bringing to the table.
I 100% agree, because I think innovation is, can you make something better, right? Can you make a process? Can you make something that, is painful and, get rid of that pain or fill, kind of bridge that gap or just make it a better process. And if you're doing that, from my perspective, you're innovating.
All right, Curtis, obviously Intermountain is well known now for one of the, premier supply chains out there. But at that time, when that was kind of your starting position, sounds like, you started, implementing some of these tools, creating some of these technologies and things. Was there a aha moment like, oh, we definitely need to be doing this? And did you play a role in implementing any of those?
Yeah. So I was a finance analyst for a whole long, 1 year. And then I worked on a pharmacy project. We were evaluating our pharmacy distributor. So it was McKesson, Cardinal, AmerisourceBergen. And I did all the analytics for it. And the pharmacy leader came to me and said, hey, we need somebody over the pharmacy supply chain. Would you be interested? And I was like, absolutely. So I jumped into pharmacy pretty quick. And there, when I got into pharmacy and I was learning pharmacy, one thing is a little bit of a side tangent, but particularly for people who are in supply chain, they're like, how do you take somebody who doesn't know pharmacy and you throw them into pharmacy? And then how do you gain credibility in the space? The number one thing is, I never went in and pretended to know things that I don't know, right? Like just go in and learn and don't pretend to know anything. And that quickly I was able to, build some respect within the pharmacy teams and all the pharmacy directors at all the hospitals. And I was able to provide value in ways that they hadn't, traditionally been able to have, get that value, whether it's, getting data visibility. Pharmacy is so massive. It's really one of the most complex categories to spend across any industry, not just healthcare. And there's a lot of reasons why for that, not just the number of SKUs and manufacturers, price changes, but then regulations, 340B program, DSCSA. There's just a whole lot that makes it super complicated. And so I was learning in that space, and you start to see opportunities. What I would do is we had 22 hospitals, and I made it a goal that I would visit all 22 hospitals at least once a year and meet with the pharmacy director, learn what their pain points were. one of the things that I saw was the duplication of services that were happening at each of the hospital pharmacies. It was like, why can't this be centralized? Like you have at each hospital pharmacy, you had people who were packaging medications so there would be unit dose for the bedside. So it'd have to be barcode ready, unit dose to be able to provide patients at the bedside. And you're seeing that, and you're seeing that replication of service, across 22 sites. You're like, why can't we do the packaging centrally? So we don't have to all, have staff doing it at 22 places, but we'll package it centrally, and then we'll ship that out to the sites that's already ready to go. But that was just one example. And that was a big thing that I saw, was the centralization of services that we could start to do. And I started exploring who's doing this in the country. There's got to be somebody else, other health systems, and ended up doing a roadshow. And I would visit different health systems around the country that is doing some form of centralization. This was early on, right? This was, 2008, 2009, when CSCs were not super common in the space, but there were a few out there. Mercy was doing it, LESAR, UCSF. So there are a few kind of players in the space, and I remember going and meeting with all of them. But that was one of the innovative things that, trying to break the mold a little bit. So I wrote a business plan and said, hey, I really think we should centralize these pharmacy services to some central kind of distribution center. And the med surge team was looking at doing the same thing. And then eventually that kind of led to a broader business plan for Intermountain Supply Chain Center, which, if anybody's been there, I mean, it's incredible. And I recommend, if you're in supply chain and healthcare, it's definitely a place to visit. But in that spot, you have med surge, you have a pharmacy, centralized pharmacy services going out of there, and a lot of cool stuff. But, Hayes, I don't know, to kind of answer your question, a long way to answer your question, but
I think with that pharmacy piece too, that's an area I don't have a lot of experience in, Curtis. But when you and I were talking, you were kind of explaining to me that the spend doesn't go through the ERP, and that really creates some data issues for supply chains. And not to mention, kind of the old way is take a pharmacist and let them manage it. And this is the second largest category of spend for a hospital outside of the labor spend, right? And so this is a significant chunk, and we're not even necessarily, at least in the old days, we didn't have anybody with supply chain background managing it. We were really trying to convert, pharmacists into this role, right? So how does that ERP, or how does the lack of it going through the ERP create such disconnect with the data?
Yeah, it's it's painful. You're right. It is, it's typically the largest category of non-labor spend within the health system. And when we don't have the visibility to it. I remember when I was at Intermountain, we were using PeopleSoft as our ERP, and we had Cynthia Shumway. So Cynthia, she's well known in the space and super, super sharp. And she kind of managed everything PeopleSoft at Intermountain. And I remember I met with her and I said, hey, is there any way we could get pharmacy into the ERP? Because really what you have in pharmacy, you have buyers that jump on the wholesaler's website. 90% of the spend is going through there. They just build an order on the wholesaler's website. And then there's this long tail, 10% of the spend that they're calling in orders, they're emailing orders, they're faxing orders, they're jumping from website to place orders. It's a very painful process. And I'm like, why can't we get rid of this and just run everything through the ERP? We set up a meeting with some of the PeopleSoft team and others. We go through it and they're like, yeah, no, this is what we're built to do. We're built to kind of route orders to different vendors and everything. They're like, okay, great. And then you start asking them, questions like, and this is, for those in pharmacy would kind of laugh at this, but you ask a question like, well, how do you handle 340B? And the response was, well, what's 340B? And, if you're in pharmacy, you're like, okay, that's deal breaker right there, because it's such a compliance element. Like it means so much, millions and millions of dollars of savings for most health systems that are in not-for-profit health systems. But there's a lot of compliance to it, a lot of regulatory elements. And I remember, anyway, I met with Cynthia and we talked about, is there any way we could get, this stuff into PeopleSoft, all our pharmacy spend? And she's like, Curtis, you would break our system. And she's right. Within pharmacy, not only do you have different NDCs, different products for the same medication, but you also have different classes of trade, which will get different pricing. So home health would get a different pricing for the same med than retail, than acute, and so on. But then you also have within those, you have different price account types. So you have your GPO price, but then you also have WAC price, which is wholesale acquisition costs, 340B. And then there's all these rules that say, well, if this, then this, if this, then this, if this, then this. And ERPs just can't
Well, that's
handle
actually the basis of coding, right? Like when you start talking about complicated maps of if-then statements, it's not data warehouse and data routing. It's literally programming. Here's the input of the situation, and then you want it to spit out the best choice. And, so now you're talking algorithms, right?
Yeah, massive if-then trees, right? That have to be built to be able to have pharmacy to be able to place orders. I mean, which is why, pharmacy has really just kind of been, hey, do your own thing. But I do think, most health systems have, done a much better job of trying to get their arms wrapped around pharmacy, understand it better, and say, where are the opportunities? Because it's huge. I kind of mentioned it's one of the most complex categories of spend. And, you look at the number of medications involved. We do studies on just price changes that pharmacy health systems deal with for the medications they buy. The average health system deals with at least 15,000 price changes every year just on the medications they buy, the specific products they buy, not to mention all the others they could be buying instead that are maybe more optimal. So it gets pretty complex.
Curtis, at our most recent pharmacy meeting, one of the big issues that came up, and it really never has bubbled up like it did this past time, was about the disconnect between managed care and payer contracts and what they're paying for the drugs. And there's this, they were all talking about the disconnect that, the managed care folks upstairs are negotiating, X prices, if you will, but they're not covering anywhere near the new course of therapies on some of these drugs. And there's this massive delta that they're all, in some cases, losing big money on not being contracted. Is that something you've seen or heard of?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably the largest opportunity for improvement in pharmacy in healthcare is those that are managing with the payers and reimbursement and everything else, and then those that are determining what are we buying and what are we paying and all that. They're two big silos. And there's like this divide. Like when I was Intermountain for 10 years, ask me who was responsible for negotiating our payer contracts. I couldn't name who. I don't know who does that. I wouldn't be able to tell you a single person, but there needs to be a better connection and integration between those two sides within health systems, because it, particularly for these reimbursable drugs, which are generally the most expensive that the health systems are paying for. When you look at these reimbursable drugs, let's take just a sample drug. Let's say it's a chemo drug or something like that. And it costs, let's say it costs the health system, like $3,000 a vial to buy that drug. Well, if then Medicare, let's just take, because CMS publishes their reimbursement rates for these drugs, Medicare publishes and say, hey, we're reimbursing this, this amount for this specific drug. Well, what we have in pharmacy now is, if you've heard the term, you have these biosimilars. So they're not necessarily you can't call them quote unquote generics, but they're essentially like the same thing that might be a less expensive option. And so the default of us supply chain people is saying, well, let's go to the cheapest one, right? Let's drive our purchasing to the least expensive drug. And because, we want to drive costs down. But what's interesting is you look at what CMS is reimbursing. So if it's a Medicare patient and they're reimbursing for that drug, a lot of times you're not incentivized to go to the lowest cost drug because you may be actually underwater. I was actually looking at one with a client today. We're looking at a drug per billable unit. Their cost was like $23 per billable unit. CMS was reimbursing $22 per billable unit. Huh. But if they jumped to a different drug, which actually cost them $50 per billable unit, CMS was reimbursing $80 per billable unit. So they were getting $30 of margin if they go to the more expensive drug. It's a stupid thing of healthcare, right? We're not necessarily incentivized to go to the best cost item because they're looking at margins, and these health systems are trying to financially survive. And they're like, you know what? We have to consider the revenue situation, because if I administer this drug, I'm underwater. But if I administer a more expensive drug, I actually make money.
it's like you have these two silos. You have a rev cycle silo and a supply chain silo. And in between is just this highly volatile profit margin that ultimately only the CFO could even have visibility to, but it's so massive that they actually couldn't get a grip on it anyway. Is that accurate?
It's even a CFO would not be able to tell you, particularly in pharmacy, just the complexities of it. It's just, and it varies by payer, right? And it also varies on, what's, again, I don't want to pharmacy geek out, but it depends on what's your mix of 340B, GPO, WAC. Like there's all these kind of elements that go into it. And that's why, like Trulla, one of the reasons we built Trulla was to have tools like this that just calculate this stuff on the fly for the health system. So they don't have to try and have these massive Excel spreadsheets that they're trying to update every month as new pricing comes in and new reimbursement comes in, that they can just click on it and they can quickly identify, hey, what's the optimal product to go to based on margin or cost or however they want to look at it.
But without a tool, you're talking about seriously, like those two silos go to the CFO, right? That's the first time in an org structure that those two areas converge, isn't it?
Yeah. No, yes. Yeah. And by the time it gets to the CFO, that it's such a high level, like you're just too far away from the details at that point.
Because I had asked after this meeting, and when this whole topic came up, I asked one of our CEOs that I deal with. I said, "Do your managed care folks have any clinical background?" And he goes, "I don't think any of them do." and then he says, "Well, they went to school for that." I said, "Well, for clinical?" He goes, "No." I said, "What? We talked about pharmacy because that's what made me think to ask him." He goes, "No." And so that to me, I'd love if someone's listening out there and they have a guy or gal who's really pharmacy related, who knows managed care contracts and knows that would be an interesting conversation too. So I'd love to have it.
Yeah, we'd love to have somebody on to talk about that.
If that's you. But anyway.
info@powersupplymedia.com. We don't talk about it enough. That's how you reach the show. And we definitely love recommendations for guests. Curtis, this is awesome. And one of the things and we're kind of relating this to a completely different sort of industry, but a conversation that we had before. And I want to talk about that pricing volatility a little bit, or that variability, because we did an interview, I think her name was Samantha Jones, and we were talking about freight and freight management and how, they're constantly renegotiating, those contracts, sometimes even on a monthly basis, because the industry is so volatile. And then you just told me, what was it, 1,500 or 15,000? 15,000. So you can't even really get a handle on the pricing, because is it changing almost on that same kind of basis where it's something like every month you've got to be aware of a change that's happening in the pricing? Yeah.
So with all of our clients that we work with, we get daily catalog feeds from all the wholesalers on their accounts. And, every day there can be hundreds of price changes that are showing up for the health system. And, it's impossible for a buyer to stay on top of all of that, right? For them to determine, say, okay, now I should switch to this one, or now I should switch to this one. And I don't necessarily recommend people do that either. I think there is some value in being loyal to manufacturers. And because when there's a shortage or something like that, you want people who have your back and not people who are just chasing price all the time. So I'm not a huge fan of just chasing price. However, you've got to be aware of what's happening, in the market, whether it's medications or it's anything else. You got to be aware of what's happening with your pricing so that you aren't just leaving just huge amounts of money just sit on the table. And you have to have tools. Like you have to have tools to help you stay on top of it. And again, one of the reasons we built Trulla was, to kind of take that where the buyer doesn't have to think about what NDC, which product am I supposed to buy? They're shopping medications in the software. They're not necessarily shopping NDCs. Let the software drive to the health system's preferred NDC, whether that's who they've contracted with and they're trying to drive a strategic contract, or if they want, the software to just automatically determine based on that health system's preferences what that preferred product should be and move to that one. And you got to make it automated because it's so much. There's too much volatility to be able for any buyer to stay on top of it.
I'm a huge fan of the show Billions on HBO. I don't know if you've ever watched that, But when you talk about this, I'm like thinking about like a hedge fund and like just the way that they're watching the data move so quickly and hedging their bets. It literally sounds like that kind of just day to day change that, watching trending and all of that I don't know how you survive that without a tool. Literally.
And you really don't. Like there just really hasn't been tools in pharmacy for like decades, right? Buying's been the same in hospital pharmacy for decades. And so that's been going on. And then you've got, software now that can help with this, right? That can help do it. Because before you have buyers, you ask a buyer, how do you know what, NDC, National Drug Code to buy? And they say, I just buy the one I always buy. And sure enough, if you have a health system that has 10 hospitals, pretty much they might be buying 10 different NDCs for the same medication. So they're not standardized.
So are you calling Curtis like Axe? Isn't that his name?
Yeah,
so
he's Axe.
Okay, and billions. Okay.
Yeah, he's like Axe, and he's just sitting in front of his computer, and he's watching this all happen, and then somehow,
but he's
he's got all these crazy, awesome people on his team, and he just puts it all together, and all of a sudden, everybody's like, on the upswing. But I didn't realize that you could literally lose money, though. That is like in pharmacy, if you're not paying attention, you can literally be driving your profit downward. That almost so counterintuitive.
There are so many medications that depending on who the payer is, if you administer that med, you will lose money. You guaranteed you're losing money. If you administer that specific med for that payer, you're not gonna make your money back.
There you go. So he's an ethical, high character Axe. That's it.
I love that.
I wonder how many people out there actually know the show, but it's a great show. Curtis, this has been a wonderful, wonderful discussion. I want to kind of give you an opportunity to add anything to the conversation that you feel like, it's kind of a point that we missed, or if you've got any great HBO shows that people haven't watched, maybe some recommendations.
Yeah, Succession. I was just going to say Succession. That one's fascinating for sure.
Rory.
I would say just, kind of on the topic of innovation a little bit, like that's how we, make healthcare better in this country, is you have people who see problems and want to make them better. And, I've met some incredible people over the years in healthcare that have just done some really awesome stuff, built amazing tools, implemented really cool processes, thought outside the box. Hayes, that's why I love going to your events, because you get to hear what people are doing. And you're like, well, that's cool. I haven't come across that before. That's a great idea. And it's those types of things, people that I think, really can make healthcare more efficient. We talk about healthcare, there's just so much fluff and waste and everything else, but there's a whole army of people that are trying to make that better. And it's fun to surround yourself with those people. And I think we just keep pushing, and, we'll make some inroads with healthcare as we keep going.
Excellent, Curtis. Thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing, I'd say an inspiring story. And that's why I wanted to emphasize early in the conversation, if you're out there and you're not really seeing yourself as an innovator, but you're doing these kinds of things in your organization, like take credit for that, own it, especially if you have aspirations, of doing special things. Definitely nurture that part of your personality, because I know one thing, and Curtis and Hayes, you'll definitely echo this: healthcare needs more of it.
Absolutely.
100%. Thank you so much, Curtis. You did an awesome job. Appreciate it.
No, thank you guys. Thanks for having me on.
That was Curtis McEntire, healthcare executive and founder of Mazree and Trulla, and great conversation around innovating in healthcare within the organization, because that's really where Curtis's story begins. And I just love it, because I think there are tons of people out there, and I know I said it several times during our discussion today, Hayes, but I think there are tons of people out there that are innovating every single day, working with what they have, and they may not realize that some of the insights that they're gathering as they innovate are really, really important to share throughout the industry. And to your point, also always looking for people to come and tell those success stories on this show. So if you have one and you're interested in sharing it with us, go ahead and send an email to info@powersupplymedia.com. Hayes, I know you know Curtis and you go back a little ways. He talked about the value of going to some of your events and hearing a lot of these innovative stories and ideas. And I think, honestly, we've got to move so much faster in healthcare. We need these discussions.
Oh, of course we do. And, but, kind of to your point there, Justin, there's Tommy in Tupelo out there that's got an Excel spreadsheet and doing the very best he can, and he's making a difference. But there's somebody else that's at another place that's even doing something more creative. We've got to help everybody and share those ideas and those concepts and that technology so they're all advancing. But you can clearly see, there's no doubt, Curtis is an absolute, he's a rock star in this area, and he's really, really good at it. Brought a lot of really good, I thought, comments, and, basically his overview was really, really good.
Yeah. He's got passion and detailed insight, and that is a very good recipe for success. All right, everybody. Thank you for listening on behalf of Hayes and myself. And where's Gary?
Not Gary.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Power Supply.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.